Can you guys hear me now? Yep. Good afternoon and welcome to the first session of our winter seminar series put on by the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, also known as BOCSAR. My name is Karen Freeman and I am the Manager of Reporting and Insights at BOCSAR. Today, the theme of the seminar is Closing the Gap on Aboriginal Overrepresentation in the Justice System. I would like to start today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm currently on, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia from wherever you might be joining us, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal people who are joining us today. Before we get started on the presentations, I want to let you know that we're recording these sessions. So if you do have any technical problems or drop out during the event, you'll be able to look at our recordings that we posted sometime in the next week or so. Our first speaker today is Edwina Crawford, a proud Barkindji woman from Western New South Wales. Edwina is currently the Director of the Aboriginal Services Unit in Justice Strategy and Programs with the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. Over to you, Edwina.
Thank you so much, Karen. Welcome everyone this afternoon to the BOCSAR Winter Seminar Series. I'm beaming in from the land of the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation here in North Parramatta, and I want to acknowledge those elders past and present and extend that to all of the traditional owners of the land in which you're beaming in from across the state and potentially the country today. I'm very humbled to be here today to provide the introduction. The Aboriginal Service Unit, which I'm the Director of, has a mission of building better pathways to justice for Aboriginal people, and we do that in a number of ways. Firstly, when Aboriginal people turn up to court, we hope to give them the support that they need to not only get a good outcome, but access the services and support that they need to address the reasons why they're in court in the first place. We also do that with victims to support whatever needs they have when they're coming to court. And then we also work collectively with our executive in Department of Communities and Justice to identify and prioritise initiatives and strategy that we need to take to reduce Aboriginal overrepresentation across the system in New South Wales. A big part of that work and a big part of our mission is, one, understanding the data and analytics and the volume and flow of people coming through the system, and also building the evidence base around what works with Aboriginal people in the justice system. And we wouldn't be able to do that half as well as we are currently doing that without the support of our colleagues at BOCSAR. They have been instrumental in helping us conduct evaluations that have pinpointed the effectiveness of programs like circle sentencing, which was a real milestone in the evidence bank that Indigenous sentencing courts do work, and are looking and helping with us interrogate other approaches that we're developing around domestic violence, so we can really understand our impact, and if it's working well, what it is we can do to continue that, and if we haven't quite hit the mark, what else we need to do to improve those services and those programs so people get the support that they need. Aboriginal overrepresentation is a problem that's not just in New South Wales, but across the state and across the country, and it is very overwhelming. I get overwhelmed, and I've been doing this for 14 years now and 23 years in the public sector. And sometimes when you get overwhelmed, you procrastinate and you don't know where to start. And when we get that way, and I get that way, one of my first calls is usually to Jackie and Melindy at BOCSAR and Suzanne as well, just to have a chat and go, our head is spinning. Can you help us unpack where we could start? And data is a great way to do that. I think one of the best things about working with BOCSAR is they have not only had that drive, that passion and commitment of their people to helping play their part in coming up with solutions for overrepresentation, but they've also built us a lot of very fantastic products such as dashboards and Tableau designs, and the technology behind them is a little bit above me, but what they really do is help us understand what is actually pinpointing what is actually happening in the system. And the best thing about that is it helps us start really good conversations with the people that we need to work with to try to generate better outcomes. So we have a number of dashboards and tools and products that Jackie will talk to a little bit later, and we're very excited to see everybody else use those in a way that can help you contribute to identifying what it is you can do to help reduce Aboriginal overrepresentation. I think all of us as human beings have that capacity to reflect and analyse and think about the work that we do and the impact that it has. And I'm hoping that everyone gets from today a really good sense of some of those things that Suzanne and Jackie are going to talk on today around the drivers and what's actually happening in the system for young people and adults. So I'll hand over and back to Suzanne. I hope you get a lot out of today, and hand over to Suzanne to start proceedings.
I might just jump in quickly to introduce Suzanne. Thank you, Edwina. It's always a pleasure to work with your team. It's great to work with people who are interested in data and run innovative programs and use that data to inform what they're doing. The next speaker that we have today is Dr. Suzanne Poynton. Suzanne is the Director of Research and Evaluation at BOCSAR, and she's an adjunct senior lecturer at UNSW Law. What we're going to do today is actually have Suzanne's presentation, and then we will have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you do want to make a question, you can pop that in the Q&A bar, and then we will feed that through to Suzanne at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to your question, feel free to please contact us directly at BOCSAR through our information service, and we can get back to you with a response or forward it on to the right person. So over to you, Suzanne.
Great, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Edwina, for your kind words. Echo everything that Karen said. It's been wonderful working with ASU over this time and with Edwina's team, and look forward to many more years of working together. So today I'm going to be presenting some results from a recent paper that the Bureau released looking at the fall in the number of Aboriginal young people in custody. First off, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this paper, Neil Donnelly, Stephanie Ramsey and Jackie Fitzgerald, who all made major contributions to this piece of work. So, as Edwina said, it's widely recognised that Aboriginal people are significantly overrepresented in prisons across Australia, and overrepresentation of young Aboriginal people is particularly problematic. In June 2019, the incarceration rate for Aboriginal young people in New South Wales was 19.7 per 10,000 persons. This is 20 times higher than the rate for non-Aboriginal people. However, in recent years, there's been a steady decline in the number of Aboriginal young people in custody in New South Wales, and you can see that from the graph that we have there on the screen. In December 2015, there were 145 young Aboriginal people in custody in New South Wales, but this dropped to just 121 by December 2019. Over the same period, if you look at the orange line in the graph, you can see that the number of non-Aboriginal young people in custody has remained stable. So this drop in the youth custodial population is actually contrasts with what Jackie's going to be talking about later in this presentation, where we've seen an upward trend in the adult Aboriginal prison population over the same period. The adult Aboriginal population has increased by about 20% between 2015 and 2019. Looking at the composition of the Aboriginal youth custody population, we see that there have been significant declines in both the sentenced and the remand populations, dropping by around 6% and 8.2% respectively. Similar declines in sentenced custody have been seen for non-Aboriginal young people, but we've also seen an increase in the remand population for the non-Aboriginal cohort by about 6.7% over that period. So when we're thinking about the size of the youth custody population, it's important to consider any changes in the number of young people being received into custody and the average time that the young people are spending in custody. In the upper part of this table that you have in front of you, you can see trends in the number of young people going into custody, or trends in the number of receptions. As you can see, the total number of Aboriginal young people who have been received into custody over this 5-year period remains stable. So too has the subset of Aboriginal young people who have been received into custody on remand. And this represents the bulk of young people that are entering custody. Custodial receptions directly into sentence custody are less frequent, but they have fallen significantly over that 5-year period, dropping by almost 16%. So what about exits from custody? Are more Aboriginal young people being released? And that's why we look at discharges at the lower part of the table that you have on your screen. Here we can see that overall discharges for Aboriginal young people remain stable over the period that we examined. But for the subset of young people who are discharged from remand, we're actually seeing a significant upward trend. Discharges from sentence custody, on the other hand, has decreased significantly over the period that we looked at, but this most likely reflects the significant drop in sentence receptions from 2015 to 2019. So now we turn to the time spent in custody. If we look at that, it appears that the increase that we're seeing in remand discharges for Aboriginal young people is being driven by a rise in the percentage that are spending very short periods of time in custody, that is 1 day or less. And this is shown on the graph displayed on your screen on the left-hand side. The purple bars are showing the number of Aboriginal young people who are discharged from remand but only served 1 day or less in custody, and the orange bars show the number of Aboriginal young people who are discharged from remand who spent more than 1 day in custody. So typically these short-term remand episodes arise in cases where police refused bail to the young person, but the court subsequently releases them shortly thereafter. And I'll start to talk about bail refusal rates later in the presentation to further unpack these results. So when we exclude these very short remand episodes, we find that there's actually no changes in the length of stay for Aboriginal young people on remand over the period that we looked at, 2015 to 2019. And there was also no significant change in the median duration that Aboriginal young people spent in sentence custody either. So just to recap where we're at so far, between 2015 and 2019, we saw a drop of almost 7% in the total custody population. And this is due to both a significant drop in the sentence population and a significant drop in the remand population. Receptions into custody, on the other hand, have remained stable for young Aboriginal people over this time period. But we've seen a significant increase in discharges, and this is primarily due to an increase in short-term remand episodes for Aboriginal young people. Time in custody, either on remand or in sentence custody, if we exclude these short-term remand episodes, has actually remained stable between 2015 and 2019. So in order to get a better understanding of what might be driving these changes in custody trends for Aboriginal young people, we examined various factors related to imprisonment using a variety of data sources. The factors we examined relate to 3 broad areas of the criminal justice system. Firstly, arrest rates. So have there been any change in the number of young people who are being proceeded against by the police? Or has there been any changes in the seriousness of young people's offending? We also look at bail, whether there's been any change in bail refusal by police and/or courts, and also bail breaches and revocation of bail, which can also influence the remand population. Finally, we look at sentencing. So have the number of control orders that courts have been issuing decreased over the time period that we've looked at, or again, has the nature of offending or the nature of the offences that the young people are being sentenced for changed over the 5-year period. So one explanation for the drop in both the sentenced and remand populations could be simply that fewer Aboriginal young people are coming before the courts. This could be because of either reduced offending rates by young people or higher rates of court diversion by police. To examine this possibility, we looked at trends in monthly number of young people who were proceeded against formally by the police for a criminal offence. And you have this data there on your screen now, and you can see that there has been a significant decline in the number of Aboriginal young people being proceeded against by police. When we unpacked this further, we saw that most of this decline was due to fewer Aboriginal young people being proceeded against a court. That decreased by 2.5% between 2015 and 19, but there was no change in the number of Aboriginal young people issued a police caution or referred to a youth justice conference over this 60-month period. Given the decline in court actions rather than any increase in diversion, we also considered changes in police court proceedings against Aboriginal young people by the type of offence. The figure shown here reports the 3 offences which recorded significant declines over the 5-year period that we examined. And the biggest decline was for break and enter offences, and this is the purple bar that you see in that particular graph. We also found that there were significant declines in property damage offences and also traffic offences. Similar declines amongst these types of offences were also observed for non-Aboriginal young people as well. So earlier we saw that nearly half the decline in Aboriginal young people in detention is due to a fall in the number of people on remand. Now the remand population is influenced by the number of offenders that are charged, the rate at which those suspected offenders are remanded, the length of time they spend on remand and the revocation of bail. So already we've seen that the number of Aboriginal young people coming into the criminal justice system has fallen between 2015 and 2019. Here we consider whether there's been any changes in the bail refusal rate, which could also be contributing to the drop in the remand population over this period. So the figure on the left-hand side of your screen now shows 5-year trends in the rate of police and court bail refusal for Aboriginal young people. It shows that between 2015 and 19, there was a significant increase in the percentage of young Aboriginal people who refused bail by police, increasing by about 5% over this 5-year period. The increase in the rate of police bail refusal was sufficiently high that we actually saw an increase in the volume of Aboriginal young people who were bail refused by police as well, despite there being an overall decline in the number of charges against Aboriginal young people. So this is shown in the figure on the right-hand side of the screen. And you can see that from the orange bars that there has been a significant increase in the number of young Aboriginal people who are bail refused. By contrast, we found no evidence of an increase in the rate of bail refusal by the courts, at least over the period that we examined. So these findings suggest that while police increased the rate at which they refused bail to Aboriginal young people, this didn't translate into an increase in the remand population because there was no change in the court bail refusal rate. The increase in police bail refusal did, however, lead to an increase in Aboriginal young people spending very short periods of time on remand, which we saw earlier. So another potential influence on the remand population is breaches of bail and the rate at which bail is revoked by the courts. So this figure on your screen shows the number of bail breaches established by police. That's the orange bars in the chart. And it also shows the number and proportion of Aboriginal young people who have had their bail revoked over the 5-year period. Amongst Aboriginal young people, there has been a steady increase over the last 5 years in the number of bail breaches recorded by police. And in fact, we also found this same trend for non-Aboriginal people. Interestingly, however, while police are detecting more bail breaches, the proportion of these breaches that are resulting in bail revocation by the courts has fallen significantly, from around 37% in 2015 to 23% in 2019. And as a result, there has also been a decline in the number of bail revocations for Aboriginal young people. So this is another contributor to the fall that we've seen in the remand population. Finally, given the drop in the sentence custody population, we also turn our attention to the penalties that are being imposed in the courts for young Aboriginal people who have been found guilty of an offence. As we saw previously with the arrest data, there has been a general decline in court proceedings involving Aboriginal young people between 2015 and 2019. So the number of proven finalisations declined from 2,896 in 2015 to just over 2,000 in 2019. There was also a significant decline in the number of young people that were being sentenced to control orders, and this is shown in the graph that you have on the screen. The purple bars show that the number of Aboriginal young people who received a control order dropped from 404 in 2015 to 221 in 2019. Importantly, we've also seen a drop in the percentage of Aboriginal young people who are being sentenced to a control order. It declined from 14% in 2015 to 10% in 2019, though that last data point in the series is particularly low, so some caution is warranted in placing significance on that particular point. Interestingly, among non-Aboriginal young people, there was no change in the number of proven finalisations or in the number of percentage who received a control order. So these sentencing changes do seem to be specific to Aboriginal young people. So one possible reason for the drop in control orders is that young Aboriginal people are turning up before the courts with less serious offences. So when we examine trends in the subset of more serious offences where there's a higher percentage of young people who are sentenced to a control order, we find that this is in fact the case. So the graph there on your left-hand side of your screen shows a significant decline over the 60-month period in proven court appearances for high volume property offences, in particular break and enter, robbery and theft offences. For these offences, however, there was no change in the percentage of young people who received a control order. Turning to the chart on the right-hand side of your screen, we actually see that there is a drop in both the number and the proportion of young people that are receiving a control order, and this is for community-based order breaches of community-based orders. So both the number and the proportion are dropping, and in particular, the proportion has declined quite substantially, dropping from 15.8% in 2015 to 5.7% in 2019. And again, we didn't find this pattern evident for non-Aboriginal young people over the same time period. So to summarise, together these results suggest that the recent drop that we've seen in the youth Aboriginal custodial population is largely driven by a reduction in remand, due firstly to fewer young Aboriginal people being proceeded against a court, especially for high volume property offences and some traffic offences, but also because there's been a reduction in bail revocations by the court. The number of Aboriginal young people in sentence custody has also declined, in part due to the fall in the number of offenders who are coming before the court. But there also seems to be a reduction in the proportion of Aboriginal young people who are found guilty being sentenced to a control order. This is particularly true for breach of community-based order offences. So the reduction in arrest rates and controlled orders that we're seeing for young Aboriginal people is very, very welcome news, particularly given the high rates of overrepresentation amongst this vulnerable group. However, it is concerning that at the same time we're seeing this drop in serious offending and control orders being issued by the court, the number and proportion of Aboriginal young people who have been refused bail by police has increased. This didn't translate into an increase in the remand population because the court bail refusal rate remains stable over that period of time. However, it has resulted in more short-term remand episodes for Aboriginal young people. So clearly there's more work needed here to try and understand these trends in bail. Any amount of time spent in remand can have significant negative consequences for young people. The disparity between police actions and court decisions was also apparent when we looked at bail breaches. While there has been a significant increase in bail breaches involving Aboriginal people brought to the court by police, there's actually been a corresponding decline in the proportion of those bail breaches that have resulted in a revocation of that bail by the courts. Now, we can't tell from our data whether this increase in bail breaches is due to more young people failing to comply with their conditions, or whether police are more proactively targeting bail breaches by Aboriginal young people. So again, further investigation of this is needed, in particular the nature and of the bail conditions that are being imposed by the court, whether this has changed over time, perhaps they've become more complex or onerous and therefore resulting in higher breach rates. We also were unable to definitively say what was contributing to the drop in control orders that we were seeing for Aboriginal young people. The rate of custodial sentences that were imposed was particularly low in 2019 for a range of offences. We've floated two potential explanations in the paper: the establishment of the Youth Koori Court in 2015, which is currently under evaluation, but there also has been recent efforts by the court to improve domain knowledge of non-specialist judicial officers through a 3-month rotation program in the Children's Court, which may also be contributing to these changes in sentencing practice that we've seen. So as I said, this paper has now been released and is available on our website, which you have a picture of in front of you now. So if you do want to download that paper, it is ready to go. Now, I think I'm handing back to Karen to ask some questions that have appeared in the participant chat. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Suzanne. Yes, so I'm just going to feed some questions to you. So we did have someone ask about if you conducted a breakdown by gender, and if so, what did you find?
Thanks, Karen. We don't actually have a breakdown by gender in that particular paper. We can certainly do that. But we do have some data on that in our more recent dashboards. And in fact, where we're seeing the biggest decline is amongst Aboriginal males, young Aboriginal males. We're not seeing as big a decline for young female Aboriginal defendants. So it is something that we need to look at further to see why the trends are more relevant for Aboriginal males. Most likely, off the top of my head, is due to the property offences, because that's where we're seeing the biggest decline. And young Aboriginal male offenders are more likely to commit those types of offences.
Thanks, Suzanne. Another question. Do you think that these kind of declines are sustainable, and are there opportunities for further reductions?
That's a really good question. It is difficult for us to tell at this point. Obviously, it needs to be continued to be monitored, but given the COVID disruption in 2020, that's caused some difficulties in trying to understand what is going on in terms of those custody numbers. We have continued to see a decline in 2020 and early 2021, but again, this may be due to a change in the offending environment due to the COVID restrictions and potentially the changes to the court processes as well. It's certainly worth continuing to monitor, and at the moment, from what we can see, it is looking promising that this trend is continuing.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. I think that's all the questions for now. If people have got further questions, as I said earlier, you can send them to the BOCSAR information service, and we can answer them directly back to you at a later date. Our final speaker today is Jackie Fitzgerald. Jackie is the Executive Director at BOCSAR. In recent years, her work has focused on government priorities to reduce domestic violence and reoffending and reducing the rising prison population. She's also interested in trying to understand the intractable issue of Aboriginal overrepresentation in the justice system. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks for everyone for joining us on this afternoon. So I've got the unfortunate job of following Suzanne's really positive news about that reduction in Aboriginal kids in prison and looking at the situation from the adult perspective. And unfortunately, the news is much less positive. But I'm we can take hope, I guess, that there has been such a marked reduction in Aboriginal young people in prison that maybe there are ways that we can achieve a similar result with the adult population, but we do have a long way to go, as I'm going to whip through. So there are some parallels in our approaches, and you might recognise some of the themes, but unfortunately the directions don't seem to be going in the way that we'd like for Aboriginal adults. So sorry, folks. Hopefully you heard my intro, but anyway, I'm going to just start with a bit of scene setting about the trends in Aboriginal adults in prison. So just starting from March 2013 and just going up to the present day. So it's a slightly longer time period than Suzanne referenced. And you can see here's the number of Aboriginal adults. Possibly it's because I had my earphones on. We'll see if that goes. See if this works properly. Sorry, folks. It had to be some technical glitches. It wouldn't be a COVID paradigm without that. Okay, so here's our trend in Aboriginal adults in prison. So I've heard myself say this 3 times now, but perhaps you have not at all. Here I go. It just keeps going on to mute. Okay, we're going to try it again. Okay, hopefully it's working, people. I think we might have, I think we might be in luck. Okay, so the increase over this 8-year period, around 1,000 individuals, it's at 44%. So that's a pretty large rise over that period, as you can imagine. Just to set the scene, over the same period, non-Aboriginal prisoners, adults arose 29%, so the increase is much faster for Aboriginal adults. And you can see in terms of overrepresentation, we started out, Aboriginal people were considerably overrepresented, 23.5% of the adult prisoner population, and now we're looking at approaching 26% of the Aboriginal prisoner population is of the prison population is Aboriginal. So that overrepresentation problem just getting worse. Now, I apologise in advance for not unpacking all of the measures by females and males. Obviously, the trends play out a little bit different. Broadly, the increases are similar in scale, but the nature of the increases are very different. And I am not going to do a gender comparison across the presentation. Really, we probably should do a separate deep dive into the situation for Aboriginal women. You can see here that the increase is similar. Actually, I've cut this off at March 2020 because the COVID impact on women has been a little bit different, but just try to forgive me for not exploring the Aboriginal females in particular focus, and I'm just really going to focus on the totality. So just to give you a sense of where we're going to go this afternoon, I'm going to look at a little bit of a drill into the prison volumes, certainly unpack the offence types that are contributing to that rise in the prison population, legal actions that are driving that front end, how we respond to Aboriginal people once they're in the criminal justice system, and that's captured with bail and sentencing decisions, and also breaching of bail. So just to start off, we'll look at those trends in the prison volumes. So you recognise this slide, we've been here before, we can see this 1,000 person increase over 8 years. And just a little bit of a timeline. So starting off 8 years or so ago, in 2014, we had a revision of the Bail Act, and that was really supposed to streamline the Bail Act, but one of the resulting impacts of that was actually a slight decline in people being remanded, and so a decline in the prison population. But that was short-lived and not
not even 12 months later, that Bail Act was amended and the show cause amendment was introduced, and BOCSAR has done some work to show that that particular amendment had a particular impact on Aboriginal people's access to bail, and it actually increased the remand rate across the board, but was more impactful for Aboriginal people, unfortunately. In more recent times, we've had the sentencing reforms from 2018. So this was a reform that was intended to, I guess, move people in the sentencing paradigm, move people in the way of community sentences rather than custodial sentences. And BOCSAR has also done some work to show that that has been successful, and a reduction in certainly short-term prison sentences for Aboriginal people. But you can see that that also it's a little bit of a dip, and the increase has continued in the prison population despite those sentencing reforms. The intervention, or the factor that's had the biggest impact on the prison population has actually been COVID and the criminal justice responses to the pandemic. And you can see there's a step change here in the early last year, and we're really kind of slowly recovering. And this is borne out in the prison population generally. But the overall pattern is still one of steady increasing, and we expect that the population, unless something is done to abate that trend, it will continue to increase into the future. Okay, so the prison population is comprised of very broadly the remand population and the sentenced prisoner population. So I'm just going to look at how those two contribute, those two major factors of the custodial system have changed. So the sentenced population is obviously larger than the remand population, and we can see here that both have been increasing. However, the increase is sharper amongst the remand population. So over this period, we've seen a 33% increase in the sentenced prisoner population and a much larger increase in the remand population, up 68%. And the upshot of this is really that even though the prison population is much more influenced by the sentenced prisoner population, the increase is roughly divided by the remand and the sentenced population. So about half and half are contributing to that change. And this is important in some of the discussion to come about what we could do to, I guess, reduce the Aboriginal prison population, is really looking at those factors separately and considering the various levers there. Okay, so just to recap, we've seen a considerable increase over 8 years, 44% increase, and broadly in terms of the proportion increase, it's roughly similar for women and men, but I'm not going to pretend that it's playing out, that the results are equivalent once you do that drill down. And that increase in the remand population is certainly larger than the increase in the sentenced prisoner population, but both delivering a lot of additional people into the prison population. So there's a lot of interesting information in the offence types that Aboriginal people are coming into prison for. So as I've said, there's some unique factors in the remand and the sentenced prisoner population. So I'm just going to talk about those separately. So this chart shows the nature of what Aboriginal adults are in the remand population, the offences that are driving Aboriginal adults into remand. So this is a really interesting data view, I think, and you can see that those assault, domestic violence and non-domestic violence related assault are really important in terms of making up that remand population. But also, I'm just going to highlight here all of the violent offences. You can see that sexual offences, this kind of emerging offence of intimidation is really important in terms of the remand population. And we've even got some of those low volume offences, but important offences like murder contributing to the remand population. So as it turns out, 64% of people on remand are there for a violent offence and 32% actually for a domestic violence related offence. So that's a really staggering volume that's related to violence, I would suggest, and something that is going to be a theme throughout the presentation. So I'm just now going to throw up which offences have increased the most. So which offences are contributing to the increase in the remand population. And you can see again that those violent offences are really dominating that, the trends there. So huge increase in assault volumes coming into the remand population. So we've got an extra 480 people on remand, 258 of those are there for assault. So really assault is one of the key drivers in terms of increasing the Aboriginal remand population. And that's parallels with the stock volumes here of increases in sexual offences, intimidation, murder, and some of these other lower volume violent offences. But as a group, those violent offences actually contributing to 91% of that increase in the remand population. So just a huge impact of prosecutions for violent offences on the remand population. So I'm now just going to look at how the offence composition plays out for sentenced prisoners. I just did a sneaky cough, but I just consider it to mute. Okay, so it looks similar with the exception of this breach of sentencing order group up the top. So it's a large group contributing to the sentence custody population, and that includes parole violations as well as community sentence violations. But once again, if I just highlight the violent offences, you can see that they really are making a big contribution to that sentenced prisoner population. So slightly less than in the remand population, but nearly half of Aboriginal people in sentenced custody are there for a violent offence. And domestic violence, again, 19% related to domestic violence. So that's a big concern. And once again, if we look at the increase by offence type, those violent offences really driving that volume, and in particular, again, that assault increase. So an additional 200 individuals over 8 years in sentenced custody. And some of these other offences, of course, sexual assault is really certainly nothing like the volumes for assault, but as a group also making a large contribution, and violent offences here making up 75% of that increase. So, I think there's certainly a message here about looking at how we can address the issue of violence in Indigenous communities, and that really, I think, that's got to be considered if we want to be able to reduce the custodial population. So we've considered the impact of offences and really landed on the importance of violence in driving that custodial population. Now I'm just going to look at what's matters coming into the criminal justice system and how the changes, how this has changed over time. So as you might expect from that increase in custody volumes, there's been an increase in kind of front-end court appearances. So front-end police actions towards Aboriginal people and following on court appearances. So the increase here is slightly less than the increase in the prison population, 37% versus a 44% increase in the custodial population, but in a similar order. And when we look at the impact by violent offence for particular offence types, I think you can see how the increase in particular offence types is having a contribution. I'm just going to cough in, folks. Hang on, I'm just going to mute myself. Sorry. Okay, so these are the changes in court volumes by major offence types. I'm not boring you with all of them, but just those key drivers here. Okay, so it plays out reasonably evenly, actually, in terms of which offences are increasing. But once again, you can see that the volume really is in this violent group. So 37% increase in violence, and we're seeing a similar increase in traffic matters, slightly less increase in theft, but really the volumes we're talking about in those violent offences are really dwarf those other offence categories. And we know that violent offences are offences that are likely to result in in custodial episodes. So increases in these offence categories really do translate to custodial episodes. So that's a real concern that we're seeing such a big increase in violence. Traffic and drug offences don't tend to hit the prison system particularly hard. Theft, though, also does, but you can see that this increase, it's notable, but it's nothing like the increase that we've seen for violent offences there. Within that violence group, we can also drill down further to look at domestic violence. And once you do this, you can actually see that almost all that increase in violence is actually related to domestic violence. So increase in charges for domestic violence. So 79% increase in domestic violence charges. Almost all that increase in violent offences is related to domestic violence. So unfortunately, we don't have a long time series for domestic violence in our court data. We do in our prison data. We do in our court data. But I think we can probably infer from this that the domestic violence changes are really that big driver of the custodial volumes. So just recapping that point just there. Okay, so just to reiterate, that increase in violence and in particular DV matters really consistent with the translation into custodial volumes. So we've seen that the trends in people coming into the criminal justice system, and you can imagine that that does translate to changes in custodial volumes, but there's also factors at play or changes at play within the justice system that are also more likely to result in people being remanded and also imprisoned. And these are changes in remand decisions, on bail decisions, and also bail breaches. So this shows the trends in bail refusal for Aboriginal people who are having their first court appearance. So as we've seen, the volumes of people coming into the court system has increased. So that alone would result in more people being bail refused. But we're also seeing a steady increase in the bail refusal rate for Aboriginal people. I mentioned earlier the bail reforms that occurred in 2015 that we know had were more severely felt by Aboriginal people, and you can see that bail refusals just steadily increased over that time. And if you look at what's driving that increase in bail refusals, look, a lot of it still is that volume of charges, and really most of it is that volume of charges, but the increase in bail refusal is about a quarter of the increase there. So you've seen, Suzanne's also looked at the impact of bail breaches and bail revocations. And we've seen, as we had with young people actually, an increase in bail breaches, but in contradiction to the pattern for young people, the increase in bail breaches experience for Aboriginal adults has actually translated into many more people having their bail revoked. So we've seen almost doubling or slightly more than double the number of bail revocations due to breaches, and this is, I guess, a less obvious way that people can enter the custodial system between that charge and resolution of their court matter. That one that's kind of a little bit off the radar, but we can see that it really is driving a lot of people into custody, and the increase here is about over 500 people in this later year than it was in 2014. So certainly a big influence there. And last of all, I'm just going to talk about the impact of sentencing. So this is the trend in the Aboriginal adult sentenced to custody. it's been going up. You expect it to go up though, because we've seen that the volumes of people coming into the system have increased. But has there been a change in sentencing practice, as we saw with young people? So we saw with young people that actually the likelihood of getting a custodial penalty has fallen. Actually, with adults, it's kind of shifted around, but we're kind of back to where we were 8 years ago. So I'd take this to mean that there hasn't been a big change in the imprisonment rate, and really in terms of sentencing, that driver of the increase in sentence custody or imprisonment episodes is really due to that volume increase rather than a change in the imprisonment rate. And that's not actually true for every specific offence, but it's broadly true. So the increase in custodial sentences does seem to be due to increased court volumes in the main. So just to summarise where we've come to, the factors that are driving this 44% increase in Aboriginal adults in prison, a big one is this increase in legal actions. So that 37% increase in people coming in the front door of the criminal justice system is really something that it has almost guaranteed effect on the custodial population. We've seen an increase in bail refusal, and this is also mostly due to that volume increase, but some of it is due to the increase in bail refusal rates. We've also seen this increase in bail revocations due to bail breaches, and that's contributing also. The increase in custodial sentences does seem to be related to the volume increase rather than a change in sentencing practices. But so that leads us back to that point, that first point there. And while I didn't talk about it in great length, we haven't seen changes in custodial duration or the length of custodial sentences. And picked up in this other point, we haven't seen changes in the incarceration rate. So really, we're kind of looking at these factors on the left-hand side to try to influence that prison population. And I think we can't get away from the contribution of violent offending in terms of that driving the prison population up. So prisoners with a violent offence are 84% of the total increase in the Aboriginal adult prison population. So that's a huge increase. And assault alone, so domestic and non-domestic combined, is half the total increase. So just assault is playing a huge impact there in terms of driving up the prison population. And we believe it's mostly related to domestic violence, but there'll be some contributing factor of non-domestic. So where does that lead us in terms of what we can do for the future? Where are our opportunities to look at reducing the Aboriginal adults in prison? Look, I think if we can find ways to reduce domestic violence that are outside the criminal justice system, that really seems to be the key to reducing volumes of prisoner volumes. So we have mechanisms to respond to domestic violence that are currently, I guess, leading more Aboriginal offenders into the criminal justice system. But if we do want to reduce that prison population, we really need to look at community strategies and alternative strategies that both reduce harm for victims, survivors, and also keep Aboriginal offenders out of prison, or keep Aboriginal people out of prison. Of course, look at the reasons underlying Aboriginal offending. So those kind of early or first response type strategies to look at drug and alcohol and mental health and financial stress and all of those kind of motivational factors for people offending, and are really trying to address those to try to stop offending in the first place. Look, I think we have to look at Aboriginal offenders, the bail rates, the bail refusal rates for Aboriginal offenders. So we've seen that that's been increasing. Recent work from BOCSAR suggested quite strongly that Aboriginal people don't receive the same bail outcomes or same bail decisions as non-Aboriginal people, controlling for all other factors. So it seems like there's an equity issue in terms of Aboriginal people's access to bail, and that really should be considered. Look, I think the issue of bail breaches and also sentencing breaches and parole breaches most likely should be considered, and really look at ways that we can avoid people, I guess, returning to custody or entering custody for breaching of those types of orders. And maybe there's something about the nature of orders or the nature of conditions that there could be some points of leverage there. And I guess we are also starting to see a number of other emerging strategies that are having beneficial outcomes for Aboriginal people. So we've recently looked at the impact of vocational training in custody and seen that people who participate, including Aboriginal people who participate in those programs, have improved access, have improved outcomes, so reduced reoffending for those groups. So that's a really positive result. And as Edwina mentioned, we're seeing some really great results from Aboriginal specific justice measures. So circle sentencing is one. We are currently evaluating the Youth Koori Court. There's been discussions about the Wallamar District Court for many years, but there certainly does seem to be some areas of opportunity. But I think it will be difficult unless something can be done about that, the impact of violence, I guess, and violent offending to really turn the tide on Aboriginal people in custody. So thanks for listening. Sorry for my croaky throat and sorry for my my technological issues at the beginning, but thanks.
Hi Jackie, it's Karen here again. We have a couple of questions that have come through the chat. Some of them you've already addressed actually throughout your presentation, but there's some that I'm going to put to you. So the first one is, while patterns of overrepresentation are terrible for both juveniles and adults, they're worse for juveniles. About 45% of the juvenile population are Aboriginal compared to around 25% for adults. Any comments on why we might see this difference?
Look, I guess Aboriginal young people, we know that unfortunately they do start offending. Well, they make contact with the criminal justice system earlier than non-Aboriginal people. So there's those kind of early onset and more high frequency of offending really has a snowballing effect on volumes in the youth system. In terms of volumes, the number of Aboriginal adults in prison is really alarming. So I think both have their own unique challenges, both have their own concerns, but I think the volumes that we're talking about in the Aboriginal adult system are really concerning for the Aboriginal community, and really hard, I guess, for our Aboriginal population to really live an empowered and live the lives that we all want that Aboriginal community to live, when we do have, unfortunately, such a high number of the Aboriginal adult population in prison. So I'd suggest that even though there is a starker overrepresentation in the youth space, that the volumes we're talking about in the adult system really mean you can't look away.
Okay, you touched on this a little bit, but we did get a question that was, Jackie, I'm observing the % increase in violent offences in custodial volumes and the even larger increase for illicit drugs. Is there a causal link between the two?
Look, I think that the drivers of drugs is really, a lot of that is due to policing, and so a lot of that is due to enforcement. So we can see that, we know that there's across the board, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, has been a big increase in amphetamine possession and people coming into the criminal justice system for offences related to amphetamines, but we've also seen big increases in prosecutions and criminal justice actions for dealing and trafficking in a range of different drugs. I think that a lot of that increase is due to enforcement activity, and actually similar, I'd say the same is probably true of a lot of that increase in violent offenders coming into the criminal justice system, but I don't necessarily believe that they're one and the same motivation, so that the drug volumes are intrinsically intersecting with the violence problem, and the violence problem is so pervasive that I think it's probably more useful to disentangle those two than consider them as a whole.
Okay, great, thanks. So another question. How much uncertainty is there around these findings due to issues with identification of Indigenous status in administrative data sets?
Well, that's such a great question, and such a prescient question, actually. And BOCSAR have a project on at the moment, which we really would welcome consideration from external people to look at how we do identify Aboriginal people in our data sets and try to improve that. So we're actually preparing a discussion document, and we'll plan to seek community consultation about some alternative ways to identify Aboriginal people in our justice data. And we know, I guess, through this project that there are problems with our Aboriginal identification. So we haven't yet settled on how to improve that counting. I think we really need to get community input about to give us a steer on what the best approach is, and certainly talk to Aboriginal people about what is considered to be the optimal identification method. So I'd say watch that space in this, and I guess a next step from that project would be to look at how our results, our historic results, and these kind of results hold up if you did use a slightly different Aboriginal identification method. So there's a little bit of unknown there, but we're hoping to get to a little bit more stable footing in the next coming months about Aboriginal identification. But it's I think it's a really relevant point, because if we're having these conversations, we do want to make sure that the data we're relying on is really solid, and unfortunately the source data isn't always of the quality that we'd like, and we really need to try to do the best with what we've got.
Jackie, can we have one final question? There are a couple more questions, but I will just ask people to, if they have questions we haven't answered, just put them to us through the info team on our website. So this final question for today is, what do we see when comparing incarceration rates for domestic violence offences by by Aboriginal offenders compared to non-Aboriginal offenders?
Oh, look, that's a really good question. I actually haven't looked at that explicitly in the course of this project. I would assume that it's higher for Aboriginal people, but I'm not going to definitively say that because I actually haven't looked at that explicitly. So that's a really relevant question, and I guess you would have noted in the presentation that I haven't referenced all the data against non-Aboriginal people. So I've really just